Up first, Nobel Prize-winning economist and policy entrepreneur Paul Romer.
Good morning. I hope you're all hearing me. I hope you're all keeping safe. I hope you're adapting to these very complicated times. You can get some indication of what it's like for me just by looking at how badly I need to get a haircut. I have been very hesitant to go back to a shop and get my haircut because I still think that this pandemic is a very dangerous problem. This reminds me of something that I call the brand indicator that I would recommend to you. It's not brand in the sense that you're probably used to thinking about it. It's named after someone named Stuart Brand, who said to me once, and I think he wrote this in his book as well, that the more you know about nuclear power, the less you worry about it. And the more you know about climate change, the more you worry about it. So for me, the brand indicator is a way to try and assess expert opinion. And you kind of imagine plotting a scatter diagram of how concerned somebody is about an issue against how much they know. And if the more they know, the more concerned they are, that tells you to take those concerns seriously, and vice versa. If the more concerned they are, the more they know, the less concerned they are. And I've had the unusual opportunity to focus on nothing but this pandemic since March, and I've learned quite a bit. The more I know, the more worried I get. It's a very serious problem, and we are not out of the woods yet. Now, I want to start with two stories. The first involves a time when my wife and I got a delivery of sand for a sandbox we were making for our kids, and a dump truck dumped about a ton of sand about 10 feet away from where we wanted it. So how does somebody like me approach something like this? Well, you do some calculations. I found that a gallon of sand is about 13 pounds. So that to move 2,000 pounds, we'd have to move about 140 gallons. If I could move 20 gallons of sand per hour, it would take me 7 hours. But if my wife and I both did it, it would only take 3.5 hours. So we moved a ton of sand, something that at first sounded like it would be hard to do, but in fact, it wasn't that hard. Part of what I want to emphasize here is that with more of us doing the job, we get it done much faster. Most problems we face are harder because they affect so many people, but the more people we have, the more resources we have to address the problem. So we shouldn't be frightened overly by scale. Now let me give you another story related to weight. I was involved in a team building exercise once where we were asked as a group of us, about 10 of us, to lift a table that was heavy. I think it was at least 100 pounds that we were gathered around, but to lift it only using a single finger on each hand. So each person put 2 fingers under the table, and then we found, to our surprise, that we could lift it. Now, if you do that kind of exercise I did with the sand of doing some calculations and thinking about it logically, it's not so surprising. If there are 10 of us, that means we had 20 fingers. If it was 100 pounds for the table, it was only about 5 pounds per finger. So once again, you see this result that with many people, we can do many things. But there's something different about the story of the table. On the sand, I could have asked all my neighbors to help. We could have treated it like a barn raising. Everybody could have come and gone, pitched in as available, and solved the problem. But on the table, we had this challenge of coordinating what we were doing. We all had to lift up at the same time, and we needed to put down at the same time as well, Because if you imagine if a couple people started taking their hands away from the table while everybody else was holding it, things could have gone very badly. So we'll face as humans over and over again this challenge where there are big problems. There are many of us who can solve them. Sometimes acting independently will be enough to solve the problems, but most of the time we need some kind of coordination that sets the frame for all of the things that we're going to do. And I think the big challenges and the big concerns facing government, facing business right now are all about how do we structure that coordination? How do we make sure that we can all pull together in the right way, in the right direction, at the right time? And I want to warn you that I think this is a more complicated issue than many people think. Going all the way to strong hierarchical decision-making is not going to be the solution. In fact, it may turn out to be the biggest problem that we're facing right now. Now, to frame the context for the pandemic and to understand it, part of what I've done is to think about other episodes and to see how people reacted. One is the story of the Titanic. This was a ship which everyone was certain could not sink. The captain said, modern shipbuilding is beyond that. We don't have to worry about it. They didn't have enough lifeboats on board to make room for everyone because they were sure that the ship wouldn't sink. Worst case, they'd have to ferry people from the ship to another ship, and they had enough boats to ferry everybody over. But of course, when they hit the iceberg, they ruptured the seams and flooded 5 of the watertight compartments in the ship. They knew that it could withstand flooding in 4 compartments, but not 5. So soon after they hit the iceberg and got the reports that they were flooding 5 compartments, the captain of the ship must have known that the ship was going to go down. But imagine the hesitation. Imagine how hard it was to shift from this confidence that this couldn't happen to realizing it was happening and then taking action. This is important to remember because there are always actions that we can take. Even though it was clearly going to be a tragedy, there were things to do. And the thing that amazes me still about this story is that an hour passed between the time when the ship hit the iceberg and they first started loading people into their lifeboats. They hesitated for an hour, frankly, because I assume because they couldn't believe, they couldn't come to terms with this sudden, unexpected reality. And the real tragedy of the story of the Titanic is that they had lifeboats with capacity for about 1,200 people, but only about 700 people made it into the lifeboats because they were too slow to get organized to start lowering them. They were too slow to get people on board. And as a result, people died needlessly. Now, let me switch to another story, which is perhaps even more relevant for our current context. This is the story of the French army during World War II. Before the invasion by the Germans, the French army was thought to be the best in the world. It was very academic. It was very hierarchical. It was very well organized. They had a military college where people trained and studied extensively. They had at the time better tanks than the Germans. They'd made this famous investment in the Maginot Line to protect themselves from an invasion. But yet, within 6 weeks of an invasion by Germany, the German armies had completely destroyed the French army and conquered France. So how could they be so wrong? How did things turn out so badly for them? There's a good book about this that I'd recommend if anyone is interested called Strange Defeat, written by someone who'd been a soldier in World War I, then again in World War II. And it was written when he was in hiding from, as a member of the resistance trying to understand what he had seen as a staff member in the Army and understand the Army's failure. Now, the method that has been taught in the War College in France was what they called methodological warfare. It was a kind of scientific, almost like an organizational management style of warfare. It's what you'd kind of imagine if you were doing operations research and detailed planning, telling everyone exactly what they should do. The thing that caught them off guard was that the technology had changed. It was much easier to move quickly on the ground. Their methodological approach was one that was extrapolated from their experience during World War II with trench warfare. They understood that it would be tanks and there would be movement, but they failed to understand how fast troops could actually move. And what the Germans did as a strategy was took full advantage of this possibility presented by the new technology of rapid mobility. The author of this book explained to me something I didn't know, which was that the success of the German army was not just because of the dive bombers, not just because of the tanks, but also because of motorcycles. They could move soldiers around on motorcycles very quickly, and they could support the tanks and be supported by the aircraft when they would make a sudden push in one direction. If that hit a blockage, they could try a sudden push in some other direction. If that one was succeeding, they could send more resources and then move very quickly. And to organize this style of warfare, the Germans relied on what they called mission command, where instead of asking some general at the top to tell everyone what to do, they decentralized down to the lower levels decisions about, okay, this path isn't working, let's try this other one. The remarkable story from Strange Defeat is the intellectual failure of the leaders in the French army to understand the effect of more mobility. They had seen the invasion of Poland. They could have anticipated this. They saw it as it was unfolding for 6 weeks in France, but they couldn't adapt. They were so rigidly set in all of their ways to a system that they had planned to follow that they couldn't adapt and change. The telling fact that the author describes is that each time the French retreated, they didn't retreat far enough. They kept underestimating how quickly the Germans could advance, and so they would retreat to one position, try and form themselves to get ready to fight, but they would be attacked again before they were ready and then retreat again. So there was a whole series of short retreats when what they should have done is retreated much farther and had enough time to actually prepare for battle. So where are we, and what do these stories teach us? Well, first, we were slow to respond. We in the United States were slow to respond to this pandemic. Other countries around the world responded more quickly, especially countries that had had recent experience with a pandemic. So we lacked the information and the kind of anticipation that should have let us respond quickly. But at this point, that's bygones are bygones. There's nothing to do with that. The second point to understand is that the main method for fighting a pandemic is what the people in public health call contact tracing. When you find somebody who's sick, you go ask, who have you been in contact with? Then you go test the contacts, and if any of the contacts are positive for the virus, you isolate them, keep them from spreading the disease. Of course, you've isolated the first person who you knew was infectious. So you use contact tracing to do testing, and then testing to isolate the people who are infectious. And if you isolate enough of the people who are infectious quickly enough, you bring the pandemic to a halt. Early on in this pandemic, the evidence started coming in suggesting that contact tracing would not work. The problem with this virus, compared to the most recent viruses we've dealt with, is that too much of the transmission takes place before people have symptoms, or potentially by people who never get symptoms. Contact tracing assumed that you'd see symptoms that would tell you who to go interview and then go find out about their colleagues. And the several-day delay before symptoms emerged after the time when people were infectious meant that the contact tracing traditional approach was not going to work. Now, people understood this and proposed an alternative of digital contact tracing. Maybe we could speed up the usual process of contact tracing, which was human-based and time-intensive, by having digital apps on smartphones that could actually tell you if this person is now known to be infected, who were they in contact with recently. So there was an early push to get people to adopt digital contact applications on their phones. And I want to use that to pose a quick survey question to everybody. So the first question is, do you have a digital contact tracing app installed on your phone? So I hope you're seeing that question, and you answer as appropriate. Your answers, I believe, are anonymous, so I think you can be honest. So I believe we're done, and we'll just give it a few more minutes. I'm not sure, to be honest, if you can actually see these results. So we'll give it just a few minutes more, and then I'll send you the results. Okay. So first, congratulations to the people who said, I have no idea what you mean by a digital contact tracing app. You get extra credit for honesty. For everyone else, thanks for doing your best to answer, given that it's not entirely clear what these things are. There's an indication that some of you actually have them and know about them. Some would be willing to install, but many of you are at least hesitant. You'd want to learn more about it. You might not. And there's a communication problem here with digital tracing apps. I was involved in some policy discussions very early on amongst academics, not in the government. And I concluded very quickly that the digital contact tracing approach was not going to work. For a while, I installed one myself. I thought about it, but it became very clear to me that there are so many people. Think of the people who follow QAnon. Think of the people who are vaccine deniers. There are so many people who have so little trust in technology, in firms, and in the government that many people would not install a contact tracing app. And unfortunately, these apps work. They do their job only if the vast majority of people are using them. Because to record an encounter between two people, you have to have the app on both phones. So I concluded early on that in a triage exercise, we needed to forget about contact tracing applications on phones. And as you know, Google and Apple put some serious work into trying to lay the foundation for making this work. But I tried as hard as I could to persuade people and burn some bridges, frankly, being very aggressive about this. This was a dead end. We needed to find another solution besides either manual contact tracing or digital contact tracing. And I'm afraid in this case, I've been proven right. Now, let me just then go to the next, my next question. How many applications do you have installed on your phone that are reporting your location? I'll give you time to answer this, and I hope you can see all the questions. There we go. So we have one person who answered that, honestly, I have no idea and don't even know how to find out. Many of you recognize that you may have as many as 10, some one to 3. No one so far is reporting 0. We'll give this a bit longer to go. To answer the first question, I actually did install a digital contact tracing app, an early one, just to try it and see what it was like. I don't know how many apps I have on my phone. I think it's 0, but I do know where I could go look to find out number D. Now, of course, the question's ambiguous because what I said were apps, but of course there are system reporting features in the phone, and there's an ability by the phone company to track me in any case. So even if I have no tracking apps on my phone, there's still ways the operating system and the phone companies can still keep track of who I am. And I have no idea what they do with that kind of information. I'll come back and talk in a minute about what we can learn from these kinds of facts. In terms of where we go in fighting the pandemic, there are some positive signs. We've learned that masks are very effective at limiting the spread. Recall that officials in the United States initially discouraged the use of masks, but over time they did actually start to pay attention to the evidence and switch on this. Just for the record, I want to note that I first learned about this because the head of the CDC of China said in an interview with the English language press, in answer to a question of what is the United States doing wrong, what's the most important thing it could do, he said weeks ago that most important thing would be to encourage wearing of masks. Now, the second fact that I think we have to be honest about is that just as the initial advice that masks don't work was wrong, it's looking increasingly like the advice of staying 6 foot away doesn't work as well as people once thought. Increasingly, we're recognizing that the virus can travel through these very small droplets that they call aerosols that can remain airborne for hours and which can circulate throughout an entire room. And if you have a group doing a choir practice, one person is sick, the aerosols from that one person can spread throughout the whole room. And if you're singing, you'll produce a lot of these and infect many, many people in the room, as indeed we've seen. The 6 foot rule protects you from larger droplets, which tend to fall to the ground before they travel very far. But these big super spreading events suggest that aerosol transmission is much more important than we initially thought. And therefore that things like fresh air and good ventilation encountering each other outside may be relatively important compared to just 6 feet of distance. Let me reiterate that we've made some mistakes, and the really telling flaw that we have to address is how slow we were to adapt. Our officials were slow to recommend masks, and as you know, that's still a contentious policy. And it wasn't helped by the fact that the scientific leaders in the beginning spoke as if they were confident, saying that you shouldn't wear masks, it's not important. They were thinking, of course, of trying to protect masks for use in hospitals, and they knew we didn't have enough for everybody to wear them. But they made, I think, a very serious mistake by not being transparent about what they were doing, so that when they said masks don't matter, and then they said masks matter, they undermined their credibility as experts. The other thing that I think besides masks that will inevitably be the solution to containing this pandemic is a strategy that we refer to as test and isolate. If you can just give one of these modern tests, find out who's infectious, isolate those people, It's the same strategy as with contact tracing, but you just do a lot more testing to find people. You go test where you think you're most likely to find positives, but you don't worry about tracing every single contact. There are some new kinds of devices that will be emerging in coming weeks called point-of-care devices. These are testing labs in a box that you could have in a school, have in a plant, have in an office building, and you'll be able within weeks to do the highest quality test, the PCR test, in your school, in your lab, in your plant, using these portable devices. This will reduce the time between when you know somebody's infectious and then you get them isolated, because instead of waiting 24 hours for a central lab, you'll get results within minutes. And then those people can quickly be encouraged or required to go into isolation and stop spreading the disease. And crucially, this works even if those people don't know that they're infected. They don't have symptoms. They don't realize the test can tell them. There's still an important challenge that remains, that we have to get the FDA to approve these devices quickly. They're in the field. They're being tested. They work. PCR is the gold standard of testing. We've been doing it for decades. The FDA is honestly being very slow about approving these at a time when it's urgently important that we get more testing capacity out there. So the overall impression for me from this episode is one of intellectual failure. Our academics, our scientists who were supposed to be the leaders, were not transparent about masks, and they lost credibility as a result. They were slow to understand that with so much transmission without symptoms, their old methods wouldn't work. They just doubled down on their old methods rather than looking seriously at what a new method would be. And they failed to appreciate that technology is changing. Widespread testing that would have been impossible 10 years ago or 20 years ago is actually on the verge of being widely deployed. And it's something we could have deployed months ago if we just put our mental energy into doing it. So what are the lessons going forward? And what are the lessons for you and your organizations? One of the failures in the United States was that we centralized too much. We created single points of failure where the CDC and the FDA had too many important decisions that they alone could make. And they were too slow to make those decisions. They made some serious mistakes. The CDC, as you know, produced a test that didn't work for weeks and held us back. I think the right lesson for the United States, and in parallel for other organizations, is to think about this strategy that the German army used, where you coordinate, but you coordinate partly by delegating to people who are closer to the front lines, and you encourage lots of experimentation, lots of trial and error, and feed that information about what's working back up the chain. Don't get caught in this trap of believing that the authorities, the experts, the people at the top of the hierarchy can be trusted to answer all questions, already know the answers. They're so far away and they're relying on old information. They may not be the ones who will get us the best solution. So we'll hear a lot of talk about how we needed a national plan and we weren't coordinated enough at the national level. I actually think that that's actually deeply wrong. We would have been much better if we'd had 50 states all with their own ability to design their own tests, to implement tests, to decide what to do, to try different things, to be adaptive, and we would have solved this much better. And I hope that this is the strategy that we adopt going forward. And I hope that in your organizations, you learn this lesson as well. You have to coordinate. It's like the table where a group of us are trying to lift it. But you can't coordinate from too far away, and you can't adapt quickly enough in a world which is changing too quickly for any of us to rely on some expert experience, expert knowledge that we acquired months or years ago. With that, let me thank you for listening and open it up for questions.